Famous last words. That phrase kind of brings to mind a sense of impending doom. Sometimes it's minor, like, hey, the teacher's not looking. Let me see your paper. Famous last words. Since the dawn of time, though, people have ascribed these famous last words uttered, or not famous last words, but people have ascribed an importance to the last words uttered by a person before they pass away. Remember how in the book of Genesis we had the twin brothers Jacob and Esau. Now, these twin brothers were rushing to be beside their father Isaac to receive their birthright, their father's bedside, deathbed blessing. Whoever receives the birthright gains the inheritance. Now, by rights, it belongs to Esau. He's the oldest after all. But Jacob, he's crafty. Jacob's a sly one. And he detours his brother, and then he creeps up to where his father's room is, wearing his brother's very distinctive coat. Isaac touches and clutches the coat. And then he shares his last blessing, his last words, with Jacob, not Esau. And Jacob gains the inheritance. Famous last words. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I've been to the mountaintop" speech seems to point to the ominous events that will unfold the next day in Memphis. Listen to his words from that speech. "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And God's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." The next day, he was murdered. Like Martin Luther King Jr., the Apostle Paul senses death looming, hovering right above his head as he dictated this letter to Timothy, his son in the faith. Now, to properly understand the aging apostle's parting words, we need to take just a moment to focus on the context. See, Paul wasn't that old, but the sum of his age plus the political upheaval in Rome was discouraging. He wasn't naive. He knew, though, that he was nearing death's doorstep. Remember, he wrote the words, "I'm already being poured out like a sacrifice to God, and the time of my death is near. I have fought the good fight, finished the race, and kept the faith." The year is 67 AD, and Paul's doing time in a Roman jail under Nero, an emperor whose days are also drawing to a close. Nero died about a year after Paul in the year 68 AD. Nero's reign had not been one that was very smooth. It was just a couple of years before the events that we're reading about today. It was just a couple of years before this that the Great Fire of Rome had occurred. This fire began in the marketplace, and over the course of about 3 days destroyed 2/3 of the city of Rome. It was speculated that the fire was initiated, that it was started by Nero through his desire to make room to build a new palace. Nero needed somebody to blame, and apparently Christians were an easy target, and that's where his blame was directed, which brought about an intentional and violent persecutions of the young church. Church tradition tells us that the Apostle Peter, the rock on whom Christ built the church, was also a victim of Nero's outrage and was crucified upside down. Later, Paul was beheaded, and within 3 to 4 years, the young church had lost its two foremost apostles, including one of the most eloquent and educated voices, apologist and theologian, the Apostle Paul. Today's text from Paul is written to Timothy. It's called a pastoral epistle because it's written to a pastor. These type of writings and epistles can sometimes read as dull and a little weighty and difficult to understand. They're often tedious to the average reader. However, today's text, this text, is an exception. In this lesson, we hear some really good sound advice and some incredibly powerful words of faith from Paul. Paul's last words to Timothy, I think, can be summarized and broken into 4 reminders for faith. For his faith then and for our faith today. Number 1, I'm going to ask you to repeat these after me. Number 1, recharge your batteries. Wow, y'all are like a really good classroom. Number 2, don't apologize for your faith. Number 3, hone your teaching skills. And lastly, protect what you have. When we get to recharging the batteries, Paul uses the word rekindle, which means to ignite, which suggests that perhaps the flames may have died or the fire is going out. Maybe some of our flames are flickering as we go into the grocery store and we see the prices rising. And we look at our utility bills and we know that this is going to affect some of our neighbors a lot more than it's going to affect others. It's going to put some folks in some very threatening positions. Maybe our flames flicker when we look at our local news and we hear of a murder or a missing child or an assault that's happened in our community. We may see things a little more dimly having lived through a 3rd year of pandemic. We look around the world and we see wars escalating. We see fighting across the globe. We see riots in our streets, threats of nuclear retaliation, perpetual school and mass shootings. We see this and wonder, how on earth can we possibly get our batteries recharged? For Timothy, if he had a weakness, it might have been his insecurity, his fear, or his timidity. Paul writes this morning in verse 7, "For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline." Friends, Paul had seen more danger and peril in his life than most of us will ever see in our lifetime. And Timothy had been part of many of those adventures. And now Paul reminds Timothy that living for Jesus requires courage, not cowardice. As he's talking about the faith, he reminds Timothy to never apologize for the faith. I read somewhere recently where it was written that if this United Methodist experiment has taught us anything, it's perhaps to be apologetic. It's perhaps to be apologetic in our handling of faith, but never apologize for our faith. We might be ashamed, even mortified, of the behavior of some who call themselves Christians. But so was the Apostle Paul. He despaired at those who loved the world more than they loved the kingdom, and cherished their own things and their own beliefs more than they cherished the Christ. In our gospel lesson this morning, Jesus talked about having faith the size of a mustard seed. Paul offers us that same faith shouldn't be lived in fear, and it shouldn't be lived in secret. It should be lived boldly. It should be lived fearlessly. Those were serious words for the original intended audience that was reading this. It could literally be deadly to be a follower of Christ in the early days of Christianity. especially in this region of the world. And this is the faith we choose, or perhaps the faith that chooses us. It's not always easy for us to stand up and voice. We've all been in situations where we look back in retrospect and said, I wish I could have or would have said something at that point. It's not easy all the time. So we do our best to show it through how we live. It should be in you, growing, being tended, being nurtured. Our faith should be discussed and celebrated. It should be used as we walk through our everyday lives. Our faith, it's okay to question. It's okay to wrestle with. It's okay to ruminate in. It's okay to share our faith through words, through deed, and through action. But it's not okay to apologize for it. It's not okay to apologize for some of the idiosyncrasies that come along with that territory. Finally, Paul tells Timothy to hone your teaching skills. The teaching or lessons should be sound. They should be compelling. They should be rational. And they should also have the intellectual reach for the average Jack and Jill. Sound teaching for Paul probably did not include a prosperity gospel. Sound teaching for Paul probably did not include a therapeutic gospel of self-help. Nor did Paul's teaching include God is my buddy gospel. Don't be seduced by the theological fads, Paul warned. Elsewhere, Paul complained about the itching ears and urged Timothy not to waste his time and not to waste his energy preaching divisively about theological battles that are arcane. To offer teaching that is sound requires persistence, he says. Paul saw that a time was coming when people would not put up with sound doctrine, but have itching ears. They will accumulate for themselves teachers that suit their own desires and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander away to myths. Clearly, Paul had reasons for urging Timothy to sharpen his teaching skills. Lastly, protect what you have. Paul writes to Timothy, guard the good treasure that God has given you. What you have is a treasure. Regard it as such. Paul said something similar in his first letter to Timothy when he said, Timothy, guard what's been entrusted to you. What Timothy has is faith and his pastoral calling. And that's who he is, a person with faith and a calling. Don't lose it. It's who you are. It defines you and identifies you. Paul says, in effect, don't do anything that might compromise it or set you on a course that veers away from your current bearings. Be aware of your heading. Be aware of your flight plan. Follow your true north, which is following the way of Jesus Christ our Lord. These are the parting words from Paul to this young man who was first a trainee and then an intern and then a co-worker and fellow apostle. His advice to Timothy was that he should not forget to recharge those batteries, that he shouldn't apologize for his faith, that he should hone in on teaching skills, and he should protect what he has. His words are a challenge for Timothy to pick up the mantle, to be Elisha to Paul's Elijah, and to live a life of daring discipleship. Church tradition indicates to us that this is precisely what Timothy did. He was the bishop in Ephesus for a number of years. And at the advanced age of 80, a formerly timid Timothy tried to halt a pagan festival that was being held in the honor of the Greek goddess Diana. It included a procession of idols and a ceremony full of songs. In response to his preaching of the gospel, the angry crowds beat the 80-year-old Timothy, dragged him through the streets, and stoned him to death. In his dying moments, I wonder if perhaps he recalled the words of his father in the faith who wrote, "Share in the suffering like a good soldier of Jesus Christ." Like his mentor before him, he too had fought the good fight. He had finished the course, and he had kept with the faith. Friends, may we each have a deep willingness to pick up the mantle as Timothy did. And may there be many more among us today of that kind. Amen.